Dad said it so casually that I almost missed the weight of it. We were standing in the kitchen, the same one where my mother had baked bread every Sunday for 40 years, the same one where my children learned to sit still long enough to say grace. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He just wiped his hands on a towel and said, "The farm's gone." Gone. As if land that had survived droughts, floods, and 3 generations of stubborn blood could simply vanish like a misplaced set of keys. As if one sentence could erase a lifetime of early mornings, split knuckles, and fence posts hammered into frozen ground. I remember the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence after he said it, that dull mechanical sound suddenly louder than my own breathing. I asked him what he meant, but my voice came out thin, almost polite, the way you speak when you're afraid the truth might crack you in half. He sighed, finally meeting my eyes, and told me the story he'd clearly rehearsed. Taxes had piled up. Medical bills followed. One bad season turned into 2. He said he had no choice. The land had been lost years ago, quietly, legally, irrevocably. "It's done," he said, his tone firm, almost final, as if daring me to challenge it. Nothing left to talk about. But something inside me didn't settle. At 63, I'd learned to trust that feeling. Life teaches you that intuition isn't mystical. It's memory working faster than logic. I knew this land. I knew its paperwork, its stubborn resilience, and I knew my father's pride. He was a man who would starve before admitting he'd failed to protect what his own father had died on. The idea that he'd simply let it slip away without a fight felt wrong, like a story missing its spine. I didn't argue that day. I hugged him, told him I understood, and drove back to my quiet house an hour away. But the words followed me all the way home. "The farm's gone." They echoed in my head as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying decades of memory. I thought about the time Dad had nearly come to blows with a developer who tried to buy the North Field cheap. I thought about how he kept every deed, every receipt, every scrap of paper in labeled folders stacked in the hall closet. A man like that doesn't lose land by accident. 2 days later, I went back. I told him I wanted to collect some old photographs, maybe a few of Mom's things. He waved me off, distracted, already defensive, and that alone raised another quiet alarm. He left me alone in the house while he went out to the barn. That was when I opened the closet. The folders were still there, exactly where they'd always been, thick with dust and history. I wasn't looking for proof. Not yet. I was just trying to calm myself, to reassure my nerves that grief was playing tricks on me. But then I found it. A document folded inside a manila envelope, different from the others, newer. A title transfer. Signed. Dated. Not filed. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, reading it again and again until the words stopped swimming. The land hadn't been lost. It had been moved. Quietly. Intentionally. And according to the valuation attached, it was worth $370,000. In that moment, the story my father told me shattered. And standing there in the dim hallway of my childhood home, I realized the truth was going to cost far more than money. And I wasn't sure who would survive it. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I was 64 years old when I realized I might not truly know my own father. I say that not with bitterness, but with the clarity that only age can bring. By the time you reach your 60s, illusions fall away on their own. You stop defending people automatically. You start listening more closely to what is said, and what is carefully avoided. I'd lived a quiet, orderly life. I raised 2 children who still call me for advice, still show up on holidays, still argue respectfully. I worked for nearly 3 decades as a county records clerk, the kind of job people overlook until something goes wrong. Deeds, liens, transfers, filings. I knew paper the way some people know music. I knew how truth hid in margins, how intent revealed itself in what was unsigned or delayed. That was my world. Ink, dates, seals, and silence. So when I sat on that hallway floor with the unfiled title transfer trembling in my hands, my reaction wasn't panic. It was focus. A cold, narrowing focus I recognized from years of sorting through disputes that ruined families and ended friendships. This document wasn't a mistake. It wasn't forgotten. It was paused. Suspended in time, waiting for something, or someone. I thought about my father then, not as Dad, but as the man he'd become since Mom passed. Harold Hayes had always been proud, but grief sharpened him into something quieter, more guarded. After Mom's funeral, he stopped letting people help. He stopped asking questions. He began speaking in conclusions instead of explanations. At the time, I thought it was strength. Now I wondered if it was concealment. I folded the document carefully and put it back exactly where I'd found it. That mattered. If I'd learned anything in my career, it was that truth moved best when it wasn't rushed. I left the house that day smiling, thanking him for letting me take a few photo albums, telling him I loved him. And I meant it. Love doesn't evaporate just because trust begins to crack. On the drive home, memories came uninvited. I remembered being 12, watching Dad argue with my uncle over boundary lines, his voice steady, his facts precise. I remembered him teaching me how to read plat maps at the kitchen table, tapping the paper with his calloused finger and saying, "Land doesn't lie. People do." At the time I'd laughed. Now the words felt heavier, prophetic. That night, I pulled out my old work notebooks. I hadn't touched them since retirement, but habits don't disappear. They wait. I mapped timelines in my head, dates aligning and misaligning like gears. The transfer date on the document predated the loss he'd described by almost 4 years. 4 years of silence. 4 years of telling neighbors the farm was struggling. 4 years of gently discouraging me from investing time or money into repairs. And then there was the valuation. $370,000. Conservative, even. That land bordered a new access road approved 2 years ago. Development was creeping closer. The farm wasn't dying. It was ripening. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, but because my mind was working. This wasn't about catching my father in a lie. It was about understanding why the truth had been delayed. Who benefited from the delay? Who was waiting for that transfer to be filed, or buried? By morning, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a conversation to have over coffee. This was a story written in records, signatures, and omissions. And if Dad had chosen paper over honesty, then paper was where I would meet him. I poured myself a cup of tea, steadying my hands, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I was going to learn the full shape of the truth first. Because once you speak it out loud, there's no putting it back in the folder. Families don't fracture all at once. They thin, quietly, like fabric worn soft by years of washing. You don't notice the weakness until the tear finally comes. Ours was the kind of family outsiders admired. No shouting matches in public, no scandals whispered at church. We were respectable, hard-working, private. And beneath that careful surface lived a lifetime of unspoken agreements. I was the eldest, the responsible one, the daughter who learned early that love was proven through usefulness. I stayed close to home while my younger brother, Thomas, left for the city and never quite came back. Dad pretended that didn't hurt him, but I saw the way his jaw tightened whenever Thomas called less often, visited less, cared less. I became the bridge without realizing it, translating between two men who shared blood but not language. After Mom died, that balance shifted. Grief rearranges hierarchies. Dad no longer needed a bridge. He needed control. He began making decisions alone, informing rather than consulting. Thomas and I accepted it because it seemed easier than challenging a man already bent under loss. I told myself that respecting his independence was kindness. Now I wondered if it had been surrender. The farm had always been more than land. It was identity. For Dad, it was proof that his life meant continuity. For Thomas, it was obligation disguised as heritage. He'd never wanted it, never pretended otherwise. He called it a trap in good soil. I defended it fiercely back then, accused him of ingratitude, of abandoning what had raised us. Looking back, I see how neatly Dad let that argument stand. It positioned me as loyal and Thomas as expendable. Useful categories for a man planning in silence. Family gatherings became smaller after Mom passed. Fewer meals at the long table, fewer discussions about the future. When the farm came up, Dad shut it down with practiced finality. "I've got it handled," he'd say. And we believed him because believing was easier than pressing. But paper doesn't share our loyalties. It doesn't care who stayed and who left. When I reviewed the dates again, I realized the transfer had been drafted during a period when Thomas was briefly back in town, between jobs, restless and resentful. I remembered the tension then, the late-night conversations I wasn't invited into, the way Dad's mood improved afterward. I'd assumed they were finally reconnecting. Now I questioned what had actually been exchanged. Still, I didn't want to villainize anyone prematurely. Families are ecosystems, not crime scenes. Motives tangle. Love and fear coexist. I knew my father loved us in the only language he'd ever learned, protection through secrecy. And Thomas? Well, Thomas had always wanted freedom, even if it meant burning bridges behind him. I thought about calling my brother, asking casual questions, testing the water. But I stopped myself. Information, like land, shifts value depending on timing. If someone knew I was looking, they'd close ranks. Silence was my ally for now. Instead, I revisited memories with new eyes. Dad insisting on handling Mom's estate paperwork alone. Dad discouraging me from adding my name to anything for simplicity. Dad reminding me that wills only cause fights. Each moment had seemed reasonable at the time. Together, they formed a pattern. The truth settled slowly, like dust after a door slams. This wasn't just about the farm. It was about who was trusted with knowledge, and who was managed with stories. I had been the caretaker, the stabilizer, the one who made things easier for everyone else. And in doing so, I'd made it easier for something important to be kept from me. That realization hurt more than the lie itself. As I sat at my kitchen table, family photos spread out like evidence, I felt a shift inside me. The role I'd played for decades no longer fit. If the farm had been moved in silence, then silence was no longer an option. The family I thought I understood was built on omissions. And I was finally ready to start asking why. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes wrapped in calm explanations and reasonable tones, delivered by someone who taught you how to ride a bike and tie your shoes. Sometimes it looks like concern, like protection, like love that has decided it knows better than truth. I didn't intend to confront my father that day. I told myself I was only stopping by to check on him, to bring groceries, to see if his knee was bothering him again. But the weight of what I knew pressed against my ribs the entire drive. Knowledge does that. Once it settles in you, it demands acknowledgement. We sat at the same kitchen table where he'd once taught me to balance a checkbook. Sunlight spilled across the worn wood, illuminating every scratch and dent accumulated over decades. He poured coffee, asked about my drive, about the weather. Ordinary questions. Safe ones. I waited until he settled into his chair before I spoke. "You said the farm was gone," I began, keeping my voice level. "When exactly did that happen?" He didn't look up. He stirred his coffee slowly, deliberately. "A while back," he said. "Time gets away from you." I nodded, as if that answer satisfied me. Then I placed the question gently on the table between us. "Because I found paperwork that suggests otherwise." That got his attention. His hand froze mid-stir. The spoon clinked softly against the mug, an accidental confession. He didn't ask what I'd found. He didn't ask where. He already knew. He leaned back, exhaled, and for a moment I saw the man behind the father, the one who had made a decision and believed it was his alone to make. "I was going to tell you," he said finally. "It just never felt like the right time." That sentence hurt more than a denial would have. It confirmed everything. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't been confused. He had chosen silence. I asked him why the transfer wasn't filed. He told me a story that sounded practiced, smoothed over by repetition. He said he was protecting us, from taxes, from disputes, from future complications. He said the land was safer this way, held temporarily, until things settled. When I asked who it was transferred to, he hesitated just long enough to answer without saying the name out loud. Family, he said. That was when the betrayal took shape. Not just the deception, but the exclusion. Decisions made without me, about a legacy I had helped preserve, a future I had assumed we shared responsibility for. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up helping Mom with accounts, the weekends I'd driven out just to keep Dad company after she passed. I wasn't an outsider. And yet I'd been treated like one. When I pressed him, when I asked directly if Thomas was involved, his eyes hardened. You wouldn't understand, he said. You're too close to this place. Too close. As if care were a flaw. As if loyalty disqualified me from honesty. I realized then that this wasn't a single lie. It was a structure. Built carefully over years, reinforced by my willingness to trust. The betrayal wasn't just that the farm had been moved on paper. It was that I'd been managed. My emotions anticipated and neutralized before I ever had a chance to react. I stood up, my hands trembling despite my effort to stay calm. You should have told me, I said. I deserved that. He looked away. Silence stretched between us, thick and final. In that quiet, something irrevocable shifted. Not because I no longer loved him, but because love without respect corrodes. As I left the house, the weight of the truth followed me into the open air. The farm wasn't gone. It had been taken out of my hands while I was busy holding everyone else together. And as much as it pained me to admit it, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. Once betrayal is named, clarity follows. Not peace, clarity. It sharpens your senses, quiets your emotions, and replaces shock with purpose. I didn't cry after leaving my father's house. I didn't call anyone. I went home, locked my door, and did what I had done for most of my adult life when something didn't make sense. I worked. I laid the copies of the documents I discreetly made across my dining table, smoothing them flat as if they were living things that needed air. Dates. Parcel numbers. Notary stamps. The transfer itself was cleanly drafted, too clean. No clerical errors, no rushed language. Whoever prepared it knew exactly what they were doing. Which meant this hadn't been done in a moment of panic. It had been planned. I pulled up public access records on my laptop, the same system I'd trained half my department to use before retirement. It felt like slipping into an old coat. Familiar. Steadying. The parcel number brought up the farm's history in seconds. Ownership still listed under my father's name. No sale. No foreclosure. No tax seizure. According to the county, the farm still existed exactly as it always had. Which meant the story Dad told about losing it wasn't just misleading. It was false. The transfer document listed a trust as the receiving entity. A family trust, newly formed, dormant. No activity. No assets listed publicly. Trusts are quiet by design. They don't announce themselves. They wait. And they only move when someone tells them to. I searched the trust registration next. The founding trustee's name made my chest tighten, not with surprise, but with confirmation. Thomas. My brother. The one who claimed he wanted nothing to do with the farm. The one who had drifted away, conveniently uninterested. The one Dad said I wouldn't understand. The room felt smaller after that. Not suffocating, focused. Every memory rearranged itself around this new center. Thomas's sudden return years ago. Dad's improved mood. The quiet confidence with which he dismissed my questions ever since. This wasn't favoritism born of affection. It was strategy born of fear. Still, I resisted anger. Anger clouds judgment, and judgment was my advantage. I needed to understand intent. Had Thomas pressured Dad? Or had Dad chosen Thomas because he thought I'd interfere? Both were betrayals, but only one explained the secrecy. I dug deeper. Bank filings. Property valuations. Zoning changes. That's when the larger picture emerged. A development proposal filed quietly 2 years earlier, outlining a future commercial corridor less than a mile from the farm's north boundary. The land wasn't just valuable, it was about to become strategic. $370,000 was yesterday's number. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about control. About deciding who got to benefit from timing, from patience, from proximity to information. Dad hadn't lost the farm. He'd repositioned it, without me. And that hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because of the money, but because of what it said about how he saw me. Dependable. Predictable. Someone who would accept the story and carry the emotional weight while others waited for profit. I printed everything. Copies upon copies. Labeled folders. Dates highlighted. I wasn't building a case for court, at least not yet. I was building certainty. Because the moment I confronted them again, certainty would be the only thing standing between me and being dismissed. As the sun dipped below the windows, I realized something else, something colder and steadier than anger. They had underestimated me. They thought silence would keep me compliant. That age would make me passive. That love would make me pliable. But love doesn't erase intelligence. And grief doesn't undo experience. By the time I shut down my computer, the truth was no longer abstract. It was mapped, documented, alive. And for the first time since Dad said, "The farm's gone," I understood exactly what I was going to do next. Not rush. Not accuse. But wait for the moment when the truth would hurt them more than it hurt me. And that moment I knew was coming. There comes a moment in every reckoning when you realize knowledge alone isn't enough. You can gather facts, stack documents, map intentions, but eventually, you must decide what kind of person you're going to be with the truth you hold. That was the moment I found myself in, standing at the edge of action, weighing silence against consequence. I didn't sleep much that week. Not from fear, but from calculation. Each night I replayed conversations in my head, imagining different outcomes. Confrontations rarely unfold the way you plan them. People defend, deflect, deny. I'd seen it 100 times across a county desk. I knew better than to walk in demanding justice. Justice, I'd learned, responds best to structure. The question wasn't whether to act. That had already been decided. The question was how. I considered legal routes first. I could force the filing of the transfer into the open, trigger tax implications, create scrutiny. But that path would scorch everything. Family, reputation, whatever fragile piece still existed. Courts don't heal. They expose. And while exposure has its place, I wasn't ready to burn the entire field just to prove I'd been right. What I wanted wasn't revenge. It was recognition. Accountability. An end to the quiet manipulation that had treated me like a piece of furniture. Useful, dependable, and never consulted. I called an old colleague, someone I trusted, careful with my words. I didn't name names. I didn't ask favors. I asked hypotheticals. If someone drafted a transfer and withheld filing to control timing, I said, what leverage does that create? The answer was simple. Immense leverage. And immense risk. Unfiled documents live in a gray space. They're powerful until they aren't. One wrong move and the entire structure collapses under scrutiny. That's when I understood my position. I wasn't behind. I was early. I decided then that my next move wouldn't be private. It would be deliberate, documented, and witnessed. Secrets rot when exposed to light, but only if the light is placed carefully. I invited Dad and Thomas to dinner. Neutral ground. My house. No accusations in the invitation. Just familiarity. Thomas sounded surprised when he answered the phone, his voice cautious, measuring. Dad hesitated longer, but eventually agreed. Neither of them asked why. That told me everything. The night of the dinner, I set the table the way Mom used to. Simple, respectful. No props. No paperwork in sight. I wanted them relaxed. People reveal more when they believe they're safe. We talked about small things at first. Weather. Health. Old neighbors. Thomas avoided my eyes more than usual. Dad watched me carefully, as if sensing a shift he couldn't name. I let the silence stretch where it wanted to. I didn't rush to fill it. Halfway through the meal, I asked a question that sounded innocent. Do either of you know if the county has updated zoning projections for the North End yet? Thomas stiffened. Just slightly. Dad answered too quickly. Doesn't matter, he said. Farm's gone. I nodded. Then I reached under the table and placed a folder beside my plate. That's interesting, I said calmly. Because according to the county, it isn't. The air changed. Not dramatically, subtly. Like a pressure drop before a storm. Thomas looked at Dad. Dad looked at the folder. No one spoke. I'm not here to fight, I continued. I'm here to understand why the truth was withheld. And what you intend to do now that I know it. This was the turning point. Not because I'd exposed them, but because I'd made it clear I couldn't be managed anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply placed reality on the table and waited. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the farm, but the shape of our family going forward. And for the first time, they were the ones who had to choose carefully. Silence can be louder than shouting when it's shared by people who know they've been cornered. After I placed the folder on the table, neither my father nor my brother reached for it. They didn't need to. The weight of its contents was already pressing down on them, bending the evening into something brittle and irreversible. Thomas spoke first. He always did when he felt threatened. You went digging, he said, trying to sound amused. Figures. You always did like paperwork. I didn't rise to it. I'd learned long ago that defensiveness feeds on reaction. I went verifying, I said. There's a difference. Dad finally looked at me then, really looked. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his certainty thinner. You shouldn't have involved yourself, he said quietly. This was meant to keep things simple. Simple for whom? I asked. That was when the story unraveled. Not all at once, but thread by thread. Dad admitted he was afraid that if the land stayed in his name, medical costs or end-of-life decisions would fracture it. He said Thomas was willing to manage it, to wait, to understand timing. He said I was too emotionally attached, too likely to insist on preserving something that needed flexibility. Thomas didn't deny it. He leaned back, arms crossed, and said the words that finally stripped away any remaining doubt. You'd have gotten sentimental. This way, everyone wins. Everyone. Except the person who had carried the emotional weight, the practical responsibility, the loyalty they relied on while planning without me. I opened the folder then. Not to threaten, but to conclude. I showed them the zoning projections, the development timelines, the valuations. I explained, calmly, clearly, what an unfiled transfer meant under scrutiny. How easily intent could be questioned. How quickly trust arrangements unravel when timing appears manipulative. I watched realization settle in. Not fear, respect. They understood then that I wasn't guessing. I wasn't reacting. I was informed. This doesn't have to go further, I said. But it will go forward. That was the price of the truth. It demanded movement. By the end of the night, terms had shifted. The transfer would be restructured, filed transparently, with shared oversight. Not because I demanded it, but because the alternative was exposure neither of them could control. Dad's authority no longer rested on secrecy. Thomas's advantage no longer rested on my silence. The farm didn't change hands that evening, but power did. When they left, my house felt strangely quiet. Not hollow, cleared. I sat alone at the table long after the plates were cleared, aware that something heavy had finally been set down. Confrontation hadn't brought satisfaction. It brought finality. In the days that followed, paperwork moved. Calls were returned. Attorneys asked careful questions. For the first time, I wasn't managing emotions. I was managing outcomes. Dad grew distant, then thoughtful. Thomas grew cautious. Neither of them spoke to me the way they had before. And that was the point. Familiarity built on omission can't survive daylight. The consequence of truth isn't punishment. It's recalibration. And as the process unfolded, I understood something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, grounded, like someone who had reclaimed not land, but position. The farm would remain, at least for now. But the greater shift had already occurred. I was no longer the person they planned around. I was the person they had to answer to. Healing is often mistaken for forgiveness, for warm conversations and tidy resolutions. In my experience, healing is quieter than that. It's the slow return of steadiness after chaos, the subtle easing of tension you didn't realize you were carrying until it's gone. What followed the confrontation wasn't reconciliation, it was recalibration. And that, I learned, was enough. The weeks after that dinner passed without drama. No shouting phone calls. No emotional apologies. Just movement. Documents revised. Meetings scheduled. A process unfolding the way it should have from the beginning. Transparent. Methodical. Real. I attended every meeting, not because I distrusted them anymore, but because presence itself had become a boundary. Dad aged in front of me during that time. Not physically, he'd been old for years, but emotionally. The authority he'd worn so naturally slipped into something more tentative. He asked questions now. Not permission, exactly, but acknowledgement. It was subtle, but I noticed. When you've spent a lifetime being quietly dependable, any shift feels seismic. Thomas stayed distant. Polite. Efficient. He no longer joked about my sentimentality. He no longer framed decisions without me. In some ways, that distance was a relief. We weren't pretending anymore. We were simply related adults navigating shared consequences. I didn't need closeness. I needed respect. One afternoon, I drove out to the farm alone. The land hadn't changed. Fields still rolled gently toward the tree line. Fence posts leaned where they always had. I walked the perimeter slowly, letting memory and reality overlap without resistance. This place had held my childhood, my parents' marriage, my own sense of belonging. But standing there, I understood something important. The farm didn't define me. I had spent years believing my loyalty to that land was proof of my loyalty to family. Now I saw the distinction. Places hold memory, but identity must be portable. You can love something without surrendering yourself to it. Dad joined me later that day. We didn't talk about paperwork or trusts. We talked about Mom. About weather patterns. About how quiet the house felt now. It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was the real currency. I should have trusted you, he said eventually, staring out over the field. Yes, I replied. Not unkindly. Just truthfully. We stood there in silence, two adults acknowledging a fracture without trying to seal it too quickly. Some cracks remain visible. They should. They remind you where pressure once lived. As months passed, the intensity faded. The situation became simply part of our story. Not a wound, not a triumph. A lesson integrated. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I slept better. I laughed more easily. Healing, it turned out, was less about repairing others and more about releasing the need to manage them. I reclaimed time for myself. Gardening, long walks, even boredom, something I hadn't allowed myself in years. Responsibility, when unchosen, becomes a weight. I had finally set some of mine down. The farm's future remained undecided. Development loomed. Possibilities hovered. But whatever came next would be decided openly, with eyes wide and voices heard. That mattered more than any outcome. In the end, the aftermath wasn't about land, money, or legacy. It was about equilibrium. And for the first time in a long while, I felt balanced. Not because everything was resolved, but because I finally stood on my own terms. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves as lessons. They arrive disguised as inconvenience, betrayal, or quiet disappointment. Only later do you recognize them for what they were: invitations to change the way you see yourself and the people you love. What happened with the farm was one of those moments for me. For years, I believed loyalty meant endurance. Staying quiet. Carrying weight so others didn't have to. I thought being dependable required invisibility, that love was proven through patience rather than participation. And because I played that role well, it became expected. When people grow accustomed to your silence, they mistake it for consent. The truth is, no one wakes up one day and decides to betray someone they love. They make smaller decisions instead, decisions to delay conversations, to simplify explanations, to protect outcomes rather than relationships. Over time, those choices harden into a structure that excludes the very people it claims to protect. That's what happened to us. I don't hate my father for what he did. I understand his fear now, his need to control an uncertain future. And I don't resent my brother the way I might have once. He wanted opportunity, not connection. And he chose the path that promised the least resistance. Understanding doesn't excuse their actions, but it releases me from carrying their intent as my burden. What I learned is this: transparency is not a threat to family. Silence is. We often tell ourselves we keep secrets to preserve peace. In reality, secrets only delay conflict while deepening its impact. Truth, when handled with care, doesn't destroy relationships. It reveals which ones are strong enough to adapt. I also learned something quieter, but more personal. I am not defined by what I preserve for others. I am defined by what I choose to stand for when preservation costs me my voice. There is dignity in restraint, but there is also dignity in refusal. The farm may one day be sold, or developed, or passed on in a way that looks nothing like the past. And that's okay. Land, like time, moves forward whether we're ready or not. What matters is not who owns it, but who is allowed to speak when decisions are made. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you're the reliable one, the quiet one, the one everyone counts on but rarely consults, let me tell you this gently. Your silence is not your duty. Your clarity is your right. Ask questions sooner. Read what you're told not to worry about. Trust the discomfort that tells you a story is incomplete. And when you do speak, do so calmly, with evidence and intention. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stop making yourself small for the comfort of others. The farm taught me many things over the years. How to endure, how to work, how to wait. But the greatest lesson came at the end, when I finally understood that legacy isn't land or money or names on paper. Legacy is honesty. And once you choose it, you never have to pretend again.